Hi, my name is Danielle Landry, and I'm a registered dietitian and Methodist Estherbrook Cancer Center, and I'm here today to present 4 for 15, a Zoom series in which I teach patients how to cook a healthy, antioxidant-rich meal for 4 people for $15 or less in 15 minutes or less. Let's get started. So today what we're going to prepare is a sheet pan cranberry chicken dinner, which costs a little under $15 for the ingredients that you can buy at any local grocery store, but it also includes things that most people commonly have in their pantry: olive oil, certain seasonings like salt and pepper, that kind of stuff. The recipe actually calls for a sweet potato, but sweet potatoes can be a little bit cumbersome to peel and to cube. And so what I did instead was I purchased a bag of already cubed butternut squash, cubed and peeled butternut squash that cost about $1.50 at a local grocery store because it's very time saving and it's also less labor intensive. I also did the same thing with the Brussels sprouts that are frozen and already cut up and ready to go and ready to roast. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put the butternut squash and the Brussels sprouts in the sheet pan and drizzle it with a little bit of extra virgin olive oil and seasoning, and we'll put it in the oven, which has been preheated to 400 degrees. So we're going to go ahead and use some extra virgin olive oil and drizzle a very small amount over the butternut squash and over the Brussels sprouts. We're also going to season that with a little bit of salt and pepper and a little bit of garlic powder, not garlic salt, but garlic powder, because it has a lot less sodium in it. So we're going to go ahead and season with a little pepper, a tiny little bit of salt. I actually like to put the salt in my hand because it's easier to control the amount when you put a pinch of it in your hand as opposed to just going full tilt with a bottle of salt or a container of salt. And then we're also going to put a tiny little bit of garlic powder on the vegetables, and we'll go ahead and roast that in the oven for 15 minutes at 450 degrees. If it's frozen vegetables, it's better to roast it at 450. If they are fresh vegetables, if you choose to use fresh Brussels sprouts and fresh butternut squash, roasting it at 400 for 15 minutes is a better option. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the difference between fresh versus frozen vegetables. Most people think that fresh vegetables are actually healthier for you, and that's not always the case. You have to think that we live here in Nebraska, and where do these vegetables come from? Most of the time they come from the West Coast in California, and a lot of times those vegetables were picked a week ago, they were shipped on a truck, they're sitting in a grocery store, and they're exposed to fluorescent lighting. Fluorescent lighting actually causes nutrients to be leached from the vegetables, and they leach out into the air around it. That's why in the summertime, when you see a ton of bugs or fruit flies swarming around produce in a grocery store, it's because those bugs are actually attracted to the nutrients that are being leached out of the vegetables. Whereas if you're using frozen vegetables, these are picked at their peak ripeness and then they are flash frozen and preserved. So a lot of times you're actually going to get more nutrients from a frozen vegetable than you would from a fresh one. Just something to keep in mind. Farmers markets are a great place to get fresh vegetables, but for most people here in Nebraska, frozen is great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the frozen vegetables in the oven. It's set at 450. It just went off that the oven is ready, so I'm going to put that in for 15 minutes, and we're going to let those roast. So the next process in the recipe while the vegetables are roasting is to slice chicken breast. I bought chicken breast at a local grocery store that I actually slit in half because most chicken breasts are thick enough that you can cut in half so it can feed a family of 4. What I would recommend is looking for a package that has specifically on the labeling no hormones added, no antibiotics, no additives. And this is especially important for breast cancer survivors who are very hormone sensitive, and anything that they eat, including things like dairy products or milk products, you should look for a package that says no HGB or no hormones added to aid in cancer prevention. All right, so what we're going to do next is, while these vegetables are roasting, we are going to prepare the herbs for the chicken. So we have sliced our chicken into thin cutlets for 4 people, and now we need to prepare the herb paste that's going to go on the chicken. I should grab a small bowl to go ahead and create that herb. Basically, all it requires is 2 tablespoons of butter, a little bit of sage, a little bit of thyme, and a little bit of garlic powder. So I'm gonna go ahead and grab the butter from the refrigerator. Margarine is fine as well, but for a lot of people that are looking to incorporate products that don't have additives, they prefer real butter as opposed to margarine, which has trans fat in it. Because the butter is not softened already, I'm gonna put it in my microwave for 10 seconds to go ahead and soften it to make a paste. I'm gonna do 2 tablespoons of the Irish butter. This is a half tablespoon. This is a whole tablespoon. It seems like a lot, but it actually goes a long way with the chicken. All right. Okay. And these were a little bit rounded, so I'm actually only going to do 3 of the half tablespoons. I'm going to put that in the microwave for 10 seconds. The herbs and spices that we use are going to be garlic powder, thyme, and sage. So we'll add that to the butter and we'll use that as a paste to put on the chicken. All right. So I've got the softened butter, and it still looks like butter. It's not liquefied, but it's just a softened version of the butter. And then what I'm going to use is a half a teaspoon of sage, thyme, and garlic powder. So I'll grab my half teaspoon serving, and I'll use a half teaspoon of thyme, which it's not an exact science. It may be a little over, it may be a little less. So a half teaspoon of thyme, a half teaspoon of garlic, a half teaspoon of sage, half teaspoon of garlic powder, and a half teaspoon of sage. All right. Just shake that in. Perfect. So this is still, because the butter is still somewhat solidified, I'm going to use like a spreader, a spatula, and mix this up and mix all of the ingredients and all of the herbs with that butter. So you can see it's a nice creamy paste that mixes beautifully. And so that 10 seconds to liquefy the butter makes a nice, beautiful paste. And what you'll do is when you are ready to put the chicken in with the pan of vegetables, we'll spread the paste on top of that, and that will all cook together for 20 minutes. Okay, so the vegetables have been roasted. They've been in the oven for 15 minutes at 450 degrees. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to push these vegetables to the side of the pan, which they already are, and I'm going to put the chicken cutlets in the center of the pan and cover them with this herb spread, with the butter and with the thyme and the sage and the garlic. So I'm going to put the chicken cutlets in the middle of the pan, and this is all going to cook for an additional 15 minutes. So the vegetables should be really nice and roasted by the time this is done. So I'm going to go ahead and rub the garlic herb spread all over the chicken cutlets and coat it nice and good so it has a ton of flavor. And the other thing that I'm going to do before I put this back in the oven is that I'm going to give the vegetables a gentle toss to kind of spread the olive oil and spread the seasoning around. Just give it a gentle, quick toss, and then it goes back in the oven at 450 for an additional 15 minutes. Let's get this going. There we go. All right, so the timer is set, and the third part of this recipe includes using a stock pot. So for the purposes of this recipe, it calls for a half cup of whole cranberry, but I'm going to use jellied cranberry sauce because it's much smoother and much more consistent and a lot easier to cook. So this can actually has 14 ounces of cranberry sauce in it. So you're only going to use about a third of the can for the recipe. So I'm going to go ahead and spoon this out. There's not necessarily a rhyme or reason to it. There's really no need to go ahead and measure this out in a measuring cup. I'm just estimating about a third of a cup, and I'm throwing this in the pot. For the recipe, it also calls for a 1/4 cup of balsamic vinegar. So I'll open the balsamic vinegar. I'll pour the 1/4 cup in. Okay. All right. We'll pour that in, and then we will let that cook on a stovetop with a little bit of butter. So there's a half tablespoon, so we'll use 2 of these because the whole tablespoon is has already been used. All right. And then we'll cook this over medium heat for about 5 minutes. One of the reasons that I love this recipe is because this recipe contains a lot of different ingredients that have antioxidant properties. What an antioxidant is something that is essentially cancer preventative. It prevents and attacks what they call free radicals in the body. I grew up in South Louisiana near a ton of chemical plants. And for you that grew up in Nebraska and Iowa, you've also been exposed to a lot of what we call free radicals in the environment. These are the pesticides and the chemicals that are used in the farms. For me, it was the petrochemical plants that were all around the lake that I grew up in. And those toxic environments, that toxic exposure can predispose you to cancer. What an antioxidant does that you get from food is, the way that I can describe it best is like the old video game Pac-Man. So the free radicals, the things that are cancer-causing agents that kind of float through your system, are the little pellets in the game. And the antioxidants that fight the cancer are Pac-Man. And Pac-Man goes through and he eats those free radicals and eats those pellets. And that's why eating a healthy diet is so important, because this food is medicine. For a lot of people that have chronic disease and have to take medication, I don't know that people realize that that's essentially herbs and food that has been concentrated, studied, tested by the FDA for 10 years, and that's how medication is formed. Medication is just herbs that we have figured out how to make into a pill that can prevent and treat different diseases. This is a meal that is very rich in antioxidants. The cranberry is probably the most paramount antioxidant in the recipe. Cranberries are second only to blueberries as the most potent antioxidant that you can have in your diet. A lot of people know that cranberries can, help with urinary tract health, and they can help prevent UTIs. But cranberries are also anti-inflammatories. People that eat cranberries on a regular basis have a lower level of what is called C-reactive protein, CRP, and that is a blood marker for inflammation. So people that eat cranberries have lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of diabetes. It also helps reduce the risk for different kinds of cancers, premature aging, chronic illness. It also helps with cognitive decline. So people that eat cranberries or have cranberries in their diet tend to have a lower risk of Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. So the butternut squash in this recipe is very low in calories, it's high in fiber, it's extremely high in vitamin A. A good rule of thumb is that if it's orange, it's probably high in vitamin A. So think the sweet potato that was originally in the recipe, the butternut squash in the recipe, carrots, orange juice, those kinds of things. They're high in vitamin A, which helps in eyesight, but it's also a very powerful antioxidant. It's also really high in vitamin C, which is the high holy antioxidant of all antioxidants. Vitamin C is the gold standard for antioxidants. And again, any orange food is probably going to be pretty high in vitamin C. Butternut squash also has B vitamins in it, specifically folate and niacin, and that can help with red blood cell production. It helps, increase your energy levels for people that are really tired. For example, if you're post-chemo, post-radiation, and you just feel sluggish all the time, getting B vitamins in your diet is a great way to help with your energy levels. As I'm cooking, I'm gonna cook this down a little bit and use one of my spatulas just to cook down the cranberry sauce. So the butternut squash is a great source of B vitamins. It's a great source of magnesium and potassium, both of which are great for bone health. Potassium is wonderful if you have issues with dehydration and chronic Charlie horses or leg cramps or muscle cramps. It's a really good source of potassium. And then in the recipe, the Brussels sprouts are also a great source of fiber. Fiber, of course, is something that can aid in digestion. For some people, fiber can cause a little bit of issues with indigestion and gas, but when fiber like Brussels sprouts are cooked, that actually cooks out the chemicals that cause that indigestion. It's really more raw Brussels sprouts that would cause a problem as opposed to the cooked ones. So the cooked Brussels sprouts shouldn't cause a whole lot of issues with digestion, but Brussels sprouts are also rich in a chemical called alpha-linoleic acid, which actually improves insulin sensitivity. So people that eat Brussels sprouts that have insulin resistance or pre-diabetes or diabetes, it can actually help regulate your blood sugar. It's also very high in vitamin C. It's also high in vitamin K. And I will caution you with this, for any of you that are taking a blood thinner like Coumadin, Brussels sprouts may not be a good choice for you because it causes increased clotting. And if you're on a blood thinner for any health issues, Pradaxa would not be an issue, but Coumadin actually would. And Brussels sprouts are very high in vitamin K. So if you are on a blood thinner like Coumadin, I would probably avoid Brussels sprouts in this recipe. But for other people, that vitamin K can really help in bone health and clotting. And it's also a plant-based protein. Brussels sprouts, believe it or not, have protein in it. So if you're looking to sneak a little extra protein in your diet and meat and dairy just doesn't work for you post-treatment, Brussels sprouts might be a good option for you in order to get some extra protein. And then finally, the big baddie in this recipe is the garlic. Now in this recipe, I used powdered garlic, but I also have in my refrigerator minced fresh garlic. I want to show this to you real quick. This was something that only cost me $1 in the grocery store. This is in the refrigerated section in the produce section, and fresh garlic is an absolute antioxidant powerhouse. It decreases the risk of lung, prostate, and brain cancer. There are a lot of large studies that prove this. It shows it destroys glioblastoma cells, and people who ate raw garlic at least twice a week in a large study in China, had a 44% lower risk of developing lung cancer than people who didn't. It also is a liver detoxifier, so anyone that has a history of alcohol abuse, this can be a great detoxifier for your liver. It decreases your risk of catching the common cold. And it's also been shown to reduce blood pressure and reduce cholesterol, but those studies really aren't large scale enough to show that definitively. It just shows that there's a correlation between eating raw garlic and reduced blood pressure and reduced cholesterol. All right, guys, well, the chicken and the vegetables are done roasting, and so the final piece of the puzzle is actually putting the cranberry glaze and plating it up and getting ready to eat. So we'll go ahead and pull the vegetables and the chicken out. As you can see, there's a nice little bit of toastiness to the vegetables, especially the Brussels sprouts. Okay, guys, well, we're ready to eat. So we have our roasted butternut squash, our roasted Brussels sprouts, and our roasted oven-baked chicken. I'm going to go ahead and plate a chicken breast and a half a cup of butternut squash and a half a cup of roasted Brussels sprouts. I put a little bit more in there, and we're going to go ahead and glaze the chicken breast with a little bit of our cranberry sauce. And we're ready to eat. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care. I'll see you next time.